Why don't we go ahead and get started? Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to the July 3rd meeting of the State Allocation Board's Audit Subcommittee Audit Working Group. Okay, that's a mouthful, but important working group for the State Allocation Board. I'm Bill Savage. I'm the Assistant Executive Officer for the State Allocation Board. And why don't we go around and do introductions and let us know what organization you're representing also. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Shiloh Gorospe. I'm with Vavrnik Trindane Company, an independent audit firm, so I'm here representing the auditors.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Becker with the Fresno County Office of Education, representing the County School Facilities Consortium.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Deal, and I work for FCMAT.
I'm Letty Boggs, and with Colby Technologies, and I'm representing CASBO.
I'm Andrea Sullivan with Orange County Department of Education, and I'm representing CSASA, the County Superintendent's Educational Services Association.
I'm Arlene Motsura, representing the Department of Education.
Good morning. Rick Asbell, Office of Public School Construction.
Good morning. I'm Steve Inman with the Office of Public School Construction.
Good morning. I'm Lisa Silverman. I'm the Executive Officer for the State Allocation Board and the Office of Public School Construction.
I'm really happy to have Lisa Silverman here today. Lisa, maybe you could give us a couple of opening remarks.
Wow. Before the 4th of July, Bill? Well, no. I'm actually excited about another opportunity that this work group is getting together. I think we also recognize that there were some great initiatives that was pushed forward, but I think perhaps after relooking through the hourglass that we probably need to think about some other initiatives or maybe readjusting the initiative. So I really appreciate the opportunity that the Audit Working Group is going to channel their efforts. There's many things that we could push forward, and I think they're all great initiatives to streamline and provide more transparency in the process. So we'd be happy to work on those issues and bring some resolution forward. So thank you again.
Thanks, Lisa, and I really appreciate the work that we've done together with your staff, with Rick and Steve, to develop the approaches that we're working on today, and we have been working on in the past. So I want to just take a second to outline what, oh, hi, here's another member of our Audit Working Group. Let's see, there's a chair for it right there. Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself and let us know who you represent?
Kathy, who am I representing?
Cash.
Kathy Allen, I'm with Cash. Thank you.
Great. Hi. So we're almost fully up to speed here. This is our second meeting of the Audit Working Group, and not everyone here was at the first meeting, but hopefully you've had a chance to review the material on the website and what we discussed. What we're looking at is an updated proposal for audits, compliance review, expenditure reviews for the school facilities program that includes really a three-part element that tries to be as faithful as possible to the initial recommendations that were adopted by the board, but that looks at things a little bit differently. So we're going to want to walk you through today and have OPSC staff walk you through the most recent updated material on the incremental compliance reviews, and there'll be items in the packet related to that. Also have us look at the expenditure review process conducted by OPSC, and then want to spend a good part of the end of the meeting talking about how we implement and some of the issues related to developing an external audit function that would be a part of the education audit in California, and developing a school facilities program scope that would become a part of that, because really in many ways we have some of the real experts here that can help us kind of figure out what we need to do next. Finally, I do want to have us talk about a timeline for getting back to the State Allocation Board with updated recommendations, because I think it's very clear that a lot of what we're talking about here is going to require regulatory change, potentially even statutory change, but definitely changes in some of the regulations of the school facilities program. And so we want to bring the recommendations of this group back to the audit subcommittee, hopefully in September, and then take those recommendations back to the full state allocation board so that we can begin the process of developing and implementing this new system. And part of what we want to talk about today, I think, especially under item 4 on the agenda, is what are some of the timelines related to the external audit component and how that gets integrated and developed as part of the education audit process. Okay, I'm sure that's perfectly clear now. Any other comments before we go forward on things that people would like to accomplish at the meeting today? Okay, good. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick and Steve from Mr. Asbell and Mr. Inman from the Office of Public School Construction to talk first about the first phase of the proposed 3-part audit structure, which is the incremental compliance reviews. And there's a couple of different options, and maybe you could walk us through those, Rick.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So we've got 2 sheets, one that spells out an 18-month check after fund release, and then another option that looks at 12 months after a fund release. So if you look at option 1, this is proposed timelines for incremental compliance checks, 18 months after fund release, that's the title. What we've tried to illustrate for you is once a fund release occurs, 18 months from the date of that fund release, we would take a look at the 5004s and the 5005s. The reason why we're throwing this out as an option is it's in alignment with what we currently have with substantial progress audit or review. So that's at 18 months after the fund release. The other thing I want to draw your attention to also is we've got a dash line actually under the second blue box that talks about the 5005 certifications. This is something that we're administratively doing right now. We're looking at construction contracts and labor compliance certifications on the 5005 before the funds are released. And this is in part in response to...
If I want to, sorry, Rick. Let me welcome our most recent arrival. And do you want to introduce yourself? Let us know who you're representing.
Cassandra Moore Hudnall with State Controller's Office.
Thank you and welcome. And does everyone on the working group understand what the 5004 and the 5005 are? Everybody? Okay, so application for funding and application for fund release, which contain significant certifications on the part of school districts. Okay.
Okay, so continuing forward, so going back to the first orange box all the way to the left that has the dash line, we really focused in on these 2 particular items of the 5005 because in the past we've had issues specifically with construction contracts with premature fund releases, which ultimately could result in a material inaccuracy. That actually was the highest finding as far as material inaccuracy is the premature fund release. So rather than trying to discover that later on in the closeout process, we wanted to move it further up in the process and actually before the funds are released so we can kind of take care of that problem on the front end. So that's why you've got the dash line there. The orange box to the right of that gets into the 5005 certifications that are above and beyond the construction contracts and the labor compliance. The one thing that we're looking at also is once we get the information, or we've got 30 days basically to request the information from the district in regards to what we may look at for the 5004 and the 5005. That's in alignment right now with what we have when we send out requests for information during a desk review or a compliance review. We do give people 30 days to respond. So that's where that blue area comes into play. And then we're proposing that 90 days from when we receive that information from the district that we have 90 days to complete it. So when you look in totality from the beginning to end, we're looking at a 22-month cycle. That's option 1. Option 2 shortens it up. Rather than the 18 months, you've got 12 months after the fund release. And then once again, you have the 30 days and then the 90 days. The upside of the 12 months is that we get the information a lot quicker. We can do the review a lot quicker and get it out of the way. The downside of that is there could be situations where districts can't get the information to us within 12 months. And kind of piggybacking along with what's happening with substantial progress and what's happened in the past, remember that's at 18 months after the fund release. One of the issues we see is people ask for extensions because they can't even get us the paperwork within that 18 months. So when you're evaluating the two options, keep in mind how long it takes for the district to get the information to us, whether it be within the 12 months or the 18 months. The other thing to consider, too, is if you go with the 12 months, there will be a 12-month check for the 5004 and the 5005, and then there will be another check at substantial progress at 18 months.
I have a question for you. Is the substantial progress check in regulation?
Yes, it is.
It's not in statute, though. Is it in the Ed Code? Or?
I know it's in regulation. I'm not sure about statute. Yeah.
Okay.
But what you could do is basically kill two birds with one stone. You could take care of everything at the 18-month. So something to think about.
So I'm sorry, just to make sure that I understand. So the 12 months would be your first check at the end of 12, and then 6 months after that would be the 18-month substantial progress?
And those are actually two separate processes.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is leverage what we currently have with substantial progress right now and fold it into substantial progress. If you keep them independent, then you're going to have two separate checks.
What do you require at a substantial progress review right now at the 18 months?
Give me a second here. There actually is a checklist.
Does it involve certifications?
It is not a certification, but what we do ask for are contracts. They have to be at a certain percent level in meeting substantial progress of the project. Let me read off what I've got here. At least 75% of all site development work is necessary prior to building construction activity is complete, so that would be at the 18-month. At least 90% of the building construction activities are under contract. And then a final requirement is all construction activities are at least 50% complete. So it is a standard that's laid out. There is regulation that I believe is 1859.104B that kind of lays this out, but that's what we would check at 18 months.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't ask correctly, or I misunderstood. So I wrote down, in the red box for option 2, I wrote down plus another check for substantial progress in 18 months. So I'm confused about how that's shortening up our time frame if we're going to, I'm just not following.
Okay.
So at 12 months, I get what you're asking for. That makes sense.
Right.
And then 6 months goes by and you're going to check for substantial progress?
Right, because that is a separate process. So I don't have
so
substantial progress delineated. Oops, sorry. I don't have it.
You.
I don't have it delineated on this process here. This is just an incremental compliance check. What we are advocating is down the road that you fold it into substantial progress, which would be 18 months after the fund release.
Which would make sense.
Yeah.
So in option 2, embedded in the 12 months, 30 days, 90 days, is that 18-month somewhere in there? Actually, we'd go out further, but.
No, the 18 months is not on this particular chart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Patty?
You mentioned that sometimes districts ask for an extension because they can't get the paperwork to you in that time. Can you drill down on that a little bit more? Is it because they've known this is coming, the 18-month marker, is it how much time from the notice that they're going to be reviewed to the need to give the paperwork? Is that problem the time from the start of the project to the 18 months or the time of the notice to the end of the notice?
I'm not sure. I think it's a little bit of everything on that, and I've talked to Julie Ennis, who's actually over substantial progress. I believe you can ask for a one-time extension without really any kind of reason for the substantial progress. And so maybe some people take advantage of that, and they automatically just ask for that extension.
I just wondered if it's not, I just wondered if it's a 30-day notice or a 15-day letter, or from the time the district gets notice, it's particularly difficult sometimes to work with the 15 days, even the 30 if you have holidays or people who are key and are on vacation or something.
And I'd have to verify, but I think we do have a system in place well in advance of the 18-month where people are getting notified that they're coming up on a substantial progress.
Because that would typically help.
You get notified, I think, a year out, and then several months before your 18 months is over.
Okay.
So you do
That
get
shouldn't be.
several notices.
There is in regulation a one-time exception for this
Right.
on the 18 months that they can apply for to demonstrate substantial progress to the design and site grants.
Right.
So on that portion, they have a one-time option.
They have that ability to do that,
Right.
yeah.
There seems some logic to the 18-month coordinating the two, in that you're going to dedicate some people to be responsive to OPC and OPSC and deal with that. Just wonder, from those of you who've responded to the 18-month substantial progress, is it better to have that divided out or to actually have the burden of both of them at once?
It sounds to me like under these two proposals that it would be a repeat of the 12-month process again at 18 months. So it makes sense to me
Not
to,
quite, because you're looking at a different set of criteria at the
Okay.
18-month. But you've already got an 18-month set of regulations or substantial progress regulations in place. I think it would be pretty easy to piggyback off of that and then add the requirements for the incremental review.
I agree.
It's a good thought.
I have a different thought on that. On the substantial progress review, I think those that we're used to that process already, and I think it's standing on its own has some merit because there are different criteria depending on what phase you are in, especially if you're financial hardship, to what you submit to meet substantial progress requirements. And if it got folded in with the compliance, I think it just ends up muddying the waters a little bit. So it's a separate process and a separate set of criteria to meet the substantial progress than what is just in the compliance review. So mixing them in might be confusing.
How about the issue, so let me just play the devil's advocate on that one. If I'm in a school district and it's really just it's sort of a workload question in some ways. You're going to do some work on this and take some time and develop it and put some documents together and shuttle them off to OPSC. Does it matter then that you put a few more in there and shuffle them off if you're really only, so would create a situation where you only touch the documents once instead of at 12 months and then again at 18 months? I think that's probably really the issue here in some ways, from a timing standpoint.
I would agree, and I thought, Rick, that what I heard was, once again at 18 months, that there would be a review on those the 5004 and 5005 components. Did I get that wrong?
No, that would be correct if you went with option number one. Yeah,
Okay.
we would take care of that all at the same time.
Okay, got it. I think it's also a workload issue for OPSC to have two different timelines, involved in this. And I'm thinking about, contracts, and if you went out to bid and if things didn't go so right and you had to go back out to bid for whatever sets of reasons, if you would be able to meet a 12-month timeline at a school district level. I mean, if everything goes smooth, sure, but that doesn't always happen, and sometimes you have to go back out to rebid, and I don't see any exceptions in here for the 12-month process, and that would be problematic.
The things that they're checking in this compliance review are the certifications you made before you went to the board. So those things should be in place long before 18 months. And there is also another requirement. You already have a 12-month requirement to submit your first detailed listing of expenditures in the 5006. So that first reporting happens at the 12-month marker. So the district does set to do an amount of documentation for OPC at 12-month also. So we already have a 12-month thing and an 18-month thing. Different. But
Yeah, and they are, three different things we're looking at here. And we're just looking to be able to maybe consolidate, like Ms. Deal was alluding to. It would help out workload-wise. It would also, I think, be a less of a burden on the district, too, because now you're not having to deal with 12 months and then 18 months. The delope aside, you would still have to do that. but the 12 and the 18 months, if you could put that together for the.
So you're not looking at a change of the DLOP to 18 months?
No, no. That's just expenditure reporting.
Well, I mean,
It's a pretty substantial effort, however.
I guess if part of our charge is to, of the working group's charge is to explore ways that we can streamline this process.
Right.
I mean, you know, if we could get it all into one thing, I mean, I think there's, you know, that seems like it's part of our charge. So it sounds to me like we've got a 12-month expenditure report, an 18-month substantial progress, and now we're trying to put in a certification compliance review and figure out sort of where that goes. I think if we were trying to stay consistent or true to the original working group recommendations, we'd put it as early as possible.
Yes, part of the concern is that, and I fully support the part you're doing now with those 2 reviews very early, and I agree that in my observation those were the ones you were having the most MIs on. However, the whole point was to not let the clock tick out so long before those things are looked at. And now if you're not even beginning to look at them until the 18-month review, I think we've kind of lost that immediacy. We had recommended that within the first year from fund release, that review be completed. So, you know, and I suppose we'll get to it. While you say you'll be looking only at the things that are highlighted, everything is highlighted. So
That's correct.
Well, why don't we hold off on, can you hold off on that
yeah, but
discussion just for a sec?
to the point that if it is a selected review or some elements, but not everything unless that's warranted, then that makes an early and quick review more feasible.
Well, so can I, is it possible that you could, if, let's say that the working group adopted the 12-month approach and said, yes, we want to do the certification review at 12 months. Could you incorporate, could a district go ahead and make their substantial progress review at 12 months if they wanted to as a part of that package?
I think you can do that now.
Yeah, you can do that now.
So you could certainly, probably for a large number of districts, you could probably take care of it all at one time at the earliest possible time. At the 12-month point, you'd submit an expenditure review, submit your substantial progress, and then whatever the new certification checks could all go in a bundle. And then if you needed that extra 6 months or to comply, I guess some districts or whatever would go to that point. But that seems like a possibility too. If we were trying to bundle this and keep it as early as possible in the spirit of what the original recommendations were. Jeff?
Yeah, as I think about the issue of 12 months versus 18 months, I think back to the original recommendations and the intent behind those. And the main intent being to identify potential issues early enough in the process that they could be remedied before it became too late. That's the whole point of the incremental check. So to the extent that 12 months versus 18 months changes that ability to remedy issues, I would support the earlier check on that.
So I need to get a little bit of clarification. Letty brought up within 12 months as opposed to us starting our review at 12 months. From a timeline standpoint, if it has to be completed within 12 months, then you got to back into that number. And so you could be looking at 7 or 8 months after the cert. The information would have to come to us to give us enough time to be able to look at it and then basically sign off on the cert. So something else to think about too from a timeline standpoint.
We were actually contemplating in the initial discussions that as soon as your item was approved by the board, you'd begin that certification process because you've already said we have done these things as part of that application process. So yes, we were thinking of it being rather immediate to the fund release.
I think that's.
I'm
I
open
can
to
support that.
conversation, but
I can support that. However, under the construction contracts, don't you have to have let 50%? And that's where I think the timeline issue, I like the earlier timeline if at all possible, but I don't see any exceptions to that. And if you're not 50%, then that's going to be problematic.
but if you're not 50%, you can't certify your 50%.
Right, that's true.
So
should
then
be
if they
submitting.
find that out later, that's a problem.
That's correct, yeah. We would catch it before the funds are released. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
So, can I ask if there's anyone in the audience that has a comment on this specific issue that we're talking about? Okay, just wanted to check. So, Letty, or does someone, do you want to summarize where you think we are and give us some direction in terms of where we're at?
Well, I think the committee has expressed that we do understand the synergy of coupling this with a review you're already doing or a submittal date that the district is already looking at, either the 12-month 5006, excuse me, or the 18-month. I think we still have concern that if we don't begin until then, that if a district is in a position to incur penalties, they're now adding up and they're going on with other projects and perhaps submitting other things, not understanding that they did it incorrectly. That was the impetus of the timing part. From a workload perspective, perhaps a follow-on question is the personnel at OPSC that you anticipate would be verifying the certifications, is that in the audit group, the same group that are looking at, is it different people than substantial audit? Is it different people from the receiving of the DLOP and 5006?
So within fiscal services, we do have groups that are set up, one team that's specifically for substantial progress. The other group is the auditors that do the reviews. In terms of the 5005, depending on, we may have to shift our workload around. I actually envision standing up another team just to do incremental reviews, and then they would specifically look at these certifications. So it would be another group above and beyond what we have right now.
So the coordination of the timing would be more in the efficiency of notification and in the district's mind keeping all their deadlines straight.
That's correct, and we would do the best we can with outreach to get it out there to everyone so they understood.
Okay. I don't know that we have any conclusions, Bill.
Well, it's okay. So it sounds to me like the conclusion is we want this to happen as early as possible. I'll just give it a shot. We would like the reviews to be there are 3 reviews that I've heard. We want them to be coupled as best we can, even if it might require us to change the regulations slightly or make adjustments. We want them to be coupled in a way that streamlines the process so that districts have workload consolidated, so that OPSC has their workload consolidated. So we've got early, we've got consolidated. Does that make sense in terms of trying to figure out the date or the date issue or the timing issue for this one? How else should we characterize what we want to try and get going forward?
That's kind of where we are. Perhaps question for you, why in looking at the 12-month or the 18-month and putting those timelines, what do you think is the biggest advantage of either the 12-month or the 18-month from the OPSC perspective?
Well, I think in terms of the 18-month, you're looking at piggybacking or leveraging a current system, which is substantial progress. In terms of the 12 months, it does move things a little bit quicker in the process, but it does put a little bit more of the onus on the district to be able to get the information to us as quickly as possible so we can take care of it within that amount of time.
Can I just clarify on that? What is it that the district's getting to you after the fact? If you've submitted your application, your 5004 or your 5005, you have those documents in place. You've certified to that. So they should have a nice little neat package sitting on their desk that they referenced before they signed the form and submitted it. So I'm missing what is it that is being put together and that would take the district extra time. I'm not following you.
I can't so much speak to the 5004. Maybe I can have Brian LePass come up and maybe speak to that. But remember that this is a self-certification. So things are coming through. We're trying to speed the process through right away. And the whole idea behind the self-certification was to at least get them moving and basically kind of get out of their way. And then if we need to check the certifications later, we can do that. In terms of the 5005, like I stated before, we are trying to take care of the construction contracts and the LCP up front. The other thing that we would check for is matching share and then potentially routine restricted maintenance accounts. So there's other certifications on there that you may not have right away that we may need to check.
I would suggest that that might be a good opportunity to provide a list or checklist to the district to make sure that they have all of those documents in order in place when they submit. So I think it could be more of a tool to prompt them that you have all of these things prepared before you submit so that when it comes back, you don't have to scramble to put those things together.
So it seems like we've just segued into the second part of this discussion, which is good, because I think we spent enough time on the
It
on the
actually
timing
may
issue.
bring
And thank you,
clarification
Andrea,
to
for
the first part. If we go into the second part, we may then know
what it is
how
we're
we
doing.
would weight the first discussion.
There you go. I see. So the second part of the discussion is for us to take a moment to look at, starting on page, four, and that's the 5004, and then running multiple pages beyond to that to include the 5005. And Rick, do you want to just summarize this, or you or Steve want to summarize this?
What we provided is a copy of the 5004 and 5005, and I think somebody pointed out that everything is highlighted. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the beast. This is a self-certification, so anything that's being certified on here is subject to be verified and checked. So I know that it seems like it's a lot. There are a lot of certifications on these forms, but it is, once again, a self-certification, and it may require some verification down the road.
Do you see that happening with kind of a either random or selected set of things that any district so would have to respond to? So for instance, districts would be asked 4 or 5 of these for support on 4 or 5 of these, and which 4 or 5 you get asked is going to randomly change up all the time, which would kind of have a policing effect that you knew you had to have all of them? Or would there be some that you see as so critical you always want to look at that one because that's real heavy on MIs? Or how do you see that process going? Because it seems a bit onerous to send you all the documentation when it is a self-cert program.
So I think it's really kind of a combination of what you just kind of laid out. There are certain things I think we're going to hit every single time. Your 5005, the construction contracts, and of course, once again, that's on the front end. Mm-hmm. We're going to look at the LCP, and I think we all understand if there's a labor compliance program issue, then you might be looking at material inaccuracy, but you could be looking at outright rescission also. So we understand the importance of that. So I could pretty confidently tell you those two we're always going to hit. As far as the other ones, it probably will be some kind of random sampling. I don't anticipate asking for every single piece of information associated with this. However, I will say, and maybe Cassandra might be able to speak to this, if you start looking at a couple certifications and there's a problem on a particular 5004 or 5005, I think you start to become a little skeptical, and you might start asking for more with other certifications that are on here. So it could expand.
Mm-hmm. That's appropriate.
Go ahead.
I was going to ask real quick. So is the intention then when they do submit the 5004 and the 5005 at this 12-month or 18-month point that you're going to do the incremental check, that they would submit all the backup with it at that time, or that they're just submitting those forms, and then additional backup would be requested based on your initial review.
So we would already have the forms in-house, the 5004 and the 5005, and based on what I just kind of laid out, what we might be looking at, we would send a letter to the district stating this is what we need. They'd have 30 days to give us that information, and then we'd have 90 days to complete the review.
It's also probably important to recognize that there's a significant time difference between the submission of the 5004 and the 5005, potentially, especially the way the program is run right now. The 5004 is the application for funding and for processing that happens really at the front end, and the 5005 happens when you are releasing funds to start construction. And in the world that we're in right now, you can linger a long time on an unfunded list after getting an apportionment or a preliminary from the board or an unfunded approval. You can stay on the unfunded list until there's a priority and funding round. It could be 2-3 years sometimes from the previous certifications made on the 5004. And so that's something to think about in this discussion also.
So maybe I can clarify here. The way that we have these charts set up, the trigger is actually on the fund release. Now, if you're talking anytime there's a board action, you could be talking about multiple, for instance, financial hardship. You could be looking at multiple steps. You know, there could be a design, there could be site. Any action would require review. I don't know. That might be a bit onerous, I think, for the district and OPSC to do all that. So just wanted to throw that out there. What we're proposing is based on the fund release.
But there could also be, if you're a financial hardship district or a county office, wouldn't you often get apportionments up front for site or design? So that could trigger its own set of reviews, correct?
That's correct.
I think knowing that what we're looking at are the certifications that brought you to the fund release, it seems like the first fund release ought to trigger that review, at least of the 04, if you're in a hardship and have that multiple, because then you're minimizing the distance of time to get to that 04 review. So it makes sense to me that the first fund release ought to trigger that. Now, on the financial hardships, help me, it's been a while since I did one, the incremental fundings mean that there are different things on the 05 that would become certifiable over time. You wouldn't have everything at the beginning, would you? Okay. Yeah, that financial hardship is always more complicated.
I'm going to just putting my auditor hat on here for a second. I'm just going to go back to, if we're talking about wanting to review the 5004s and the documentation that supports it, granted this being a self-certification process, I just don't see why. I think the earlier the better is what I'm getting at. I don't see why a district shouldn't have the documents available. And like I said, that's kind of coming from an auditor's perspective. If you've completed something, you should be prepared to provide any documentation that supports it. So I do believe the earlier the better. I think the longer you wait is when you get into problems with districts not having the ability to pull the documents, maybe because there's been a changeover in personnel or, whatever it might be, that those files got put in storage somewhere and now they have to go find them. So if I'm just going to put it out there, I would be a proponent of that evaluation occurring sooner rather than later, just because of the fact that I think the reason you get difficulties with getting the information has to do with many of those reasons, changeover or the longer the time, the longer the duration of time from when you did that, the farther removed you are from that, and the harder it is to pull those documents. That's just my thoughts.
I know and realize that this is a self-certification program, but if it's that problematic, just going to kind of go out there on a limb here, why don't we ask for the documents along with the form that seem to be problematic? If the problem is that most of the findings have been that they're not 50% encumbered in the contract or whatever it is that's kind of at the top of those checklists for you guys, why don't we just have those documents submitted along with the 5005 to begin with? I mean, I know we're on our honor system here with the self-certification, but kind of not, right?
So just a little more clarity. When people submit their 5005s, they are submitting their information at the same time right now. So that is something that we've implemented. And that's for what we consider to be kind of the problem areas, going back to the construction contracts and the labor compliance. Those are the two big hot button issues that we saw in the past, and we want to make sure that those don't flare back up. So we are looking at that when they submit the 5005.
Okay.
As far as the other issues, I don't know. It'd be a bit onerous to have everybody submit everything all at one time. I think it kind of goes back to we would probably do some kind of random selection in combination where we see the hot spots and ask for that information at that time.
I think one of the concerns that we had was that if we submitted all the backup at the time of the application, OPSC would stop and take time to review it all before agendizing it. And that was part of the concern why it was within a certain amount of time but not prior to going to board. It's self-certification in that I say I've got this together, get it on the board, because sometimes the timing of getting on an agenda gets pretty critical. So I think that was the idea in not submitting it all. That certainly was one of Cash's major fears when we originally talked about this idea, was because we don't want to delay the ability to get on an agenda. So we kind of need to keep that at the forefront by having them review immediately. After you're on agenda, that's different.
I don't want to delay that timeline whatsoever. That's not the thought. But if that's the problem, then maybe that's where we need to work on it. You know, and I don't know if that takes regulation.
Well, and submitting it and having it reviewed are two different things. So you could submit it, but it doesn't get reviewed until after.
Well,
Does that delay going on to the board agenda is the question, if that's the fear.
And that's really a program services question. I don't delve into that side of the house.
well,
Maybe Brian, if you want, maybe come up and elaborate.
sure. Come on up.
Well, let's see.
When we're putting a packet together, let's say to submit an 05 to go for a fund release, if we're talking about putting all the background information with it so that everything that would be needed for review is in the packet, the concern is that we would not want to slow down the march to agenda because districts want to get on that agenda as quickly as possible. So if we had to submit all the data, my sense of it is that it would, there's a collection and documentation.
I think you're speaking specifically for the 5004. Not
Oh,
the
sorry,
5005.
you're right, I said the wrong one.
That's his area of expertise, is the 5004.
So if we're required to submit, now we submit two things, that's not particularly difficult, but if we were required to submit backup on substantially more than that, would that slow the march to be on an agenda?
I don't think so. It'd be a few more things to review, but part of our review on the front end is we review everything anyways. We look at even the things that aren't checked to make sure that you're not missing things that you might qualify for. So we really do a very thorough review on the front end. If we had additional documentation that was submitted with it, if anything, I think it might make our review easier because it'd be a quicker verification process for us. That's assuming that there isn't any issues with the things that are submitted. So, you know, there could be some things in there that we might need to question, we might need clarification on that could, you know, require more attention. But I don't think it would slow the process down that much, if at all. It might even speed it up.
Well, okay, thank you, Brian. Then let's go to the 5005 next, because, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, okay, I'm a little confused because the reason for the proposal is to review the supporting documentation regarding the certifications. If they're already being reviewed during the process, why do they need to be reviewed again? You know, under like a guise of an audit or a review?
Let me clarify. We look for. Okay. Let me maybe an example would be. And and I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but a use of grants request. For those of you that aren't familiar, a use of grants request could be where you're using new construction grants to do something other than building classrooms at the grade level that they're intended to build, or if you're building another facility other than a classroom. There's a few things that a district has to do in order to qualify for one of those. Currently, we make sure that they're certifying that those things are in place. That's not something we can verify unless we have documentation from the school district. At this point in time, the district says, yes, we have resolutions on hand that cover these areas, and that's our verification process. For something like this, a little more in-depth, we'd actually ask for those documents. So we're talking about stuff like that. We look to see in the initial review if they qualify, if the things are in place, all the prerequisites are in order for them to qualify for the grants they're requesting. We might not ask for, sometimes that's just a certification. In this case, if we're talking about a more extensive review, it would include documentation in addition to the certification.
But I think, Cassandra, you raise a really good question, and I think it takes us to the issue that we want to be clear in the certification reviews that we're doing that there is, that we focus on the ones that need to be reviewed that might change, for example, so you make a certification, you say, yes, I'm going to do this, and let's take it in the case of you certify that that you're under contract. I mean, that's one of the ones that's already covered, but it may change over time. For example, the 60% commensurate, you have to have 60% of the contract, of the project value has to be in the contract. What if when you get your fund release and you get under contract in 90 days, or you're under contract, but because of the excellent bid climate, you've gotten the cost of your work is now below the 60% commensurate threshold, and this would be something that would only really come out potentially later in the game. Or you change order out some work that impacts a certification that, let's say you change order out the multipurpose room, whatever.
On you.
And not that I would ever do that, but those are the kinds of things that represent a change from what you've certified, and I think that's where we need to focus. I totally agree with you that we don't want to be focusing on things that have been certified that are probably not going to be affected as you go forward. At least that's kind of what I'm seeing, and I actually think that we probably ought to be focusing more on the things in the 5005 and what happens right at the fund release point, although 5004 items that would change would have to do with scope change like that, where you certify in your application for funding that you're going to build something, and then in the end at your construction phase you don't actually build that, or something like that. So I think that part of the work, it strikes me, for OPSC to do is sort of the backup here, and the next step is to really focus on prioritizing the certifications that need to be looked at in this review period, rather than saying every certification can be reviewed, and I don't disagree with that, but I think it's clear that there's some that are much higher priority or potential to impact the district and the state, and that we should focus on those. Go ahead. Yeah.
Just a quick thought, and I don't know if this, in the incremental review that we're talking about implementing, how much of that was going to be attributed to the 5004, because it sounds like based on what you might have just told us, much of the 5004 may already go through a review up front, and therefore maybe the incremental review focuses more on the 5005 issues. I guess I'm looking for clarity, because it does sound like there might be a little bit more than would need to be if it is already being reviewed.
So dovetailing on what Bill had stated, I think there is a case that some of those certifications on the 5004, once they're done, they're done. I mean, we're probably not going to look at those. Classrooms, though, we would probably take a look at that maybe 1 year or 18 months out. We want to make sure things are being built the way they needed to be built. So those would be maybe cause for concern where we would have to check those. But I agree. I don't think we would check every single thing in the 5004 12 to 18 months afterwards.
And that kind of does then impact the timeline of when the review would occur at that point, because the example you just gave, which would be a great example of when you would look at a 5004, at 12 months, that may not be an issue yet, because maybe they haven't gotten that far into the process, that you would even have that kind of a change to review. So I think it gets tricky. You know, initially it seems like earlier is better, but it sounds like that's being reviewed as early as possible already. So now we need to look at the timing of what the checks are that you, the certifications are that you would want to be reviewing, and when it's necessary to review them. Seems to come to mind for me now.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you could look at too is, you know, let's say you had a certification or 5004 that came in for 10 classrooms. 1 year out, 18 months out, you're still on track for those classrooms, and then lo and behold, something happens toward the tail end of your project, and we find out later that you didn't build everything. So it would be very difficult to try to catch that issue. And you would only be able to catch that at the closeout process, because that would be at the tail end.
Mm-hmm. So just one last question. Sure. The incremental reviews are going to be done on a risk basis, or will it be all districts? Or
I think it's probably going to be on a risk basis. We don't have the staffing to be able to look at every single thing. So there will be some kind of a risk. And but I think there's some things, going back to what we had with the 5005, we check every single 5005 for the construction contracts and labor code. So there are a couple exceptions where we look at everything.
Yeah, that is important to remember, that basically a district that puts in a 5005 that cannot produce the physical signed contract, that cannot produce evidence of an active labor compliance program or compliance with labor code requirements that they've engaged this compliance monitoring unit at DIR, will not be given money. Okay, you just can't get the money without those two things. So that's a pretty effective compliance review. So I think we've talked about incremental compliance review enough, and I think, does anyone want to summarize where we ended up and on this piece, or should we just keep moving?
I think it would be good to have OPSC concentrate on which elements would they think would always need to be reviewed, which would be high priority reviews if they apply to the project. Some of them don't apply to everything. And then which would be random or selective as far as you may be asked for these things. Knowing that anytime you begin to have concerns in an audit, it's always expandable. I think that's a major tenet of good auditing. You need the ability to ask more questions if you have concerns. But I think that might help clarify timing if we knew what it is you're looking at in specific, a little more specifically. Personally, I think that's great that you've separated out those two elements that you have and are looking at them even now, because I think those were very critical to the process. I think that's a great change for me. I think that's my review.
Good. So any comments from the audience? From the public? Okay, hearing none. So it's almost 11 o'clock. Everybody doing okay? Okay. So it's time to move on to what I'd like to do at this point is, so we can try and get out at noon, is take at most a half an hour on expenditure reviews and then do the external audits and the education audit discussion for half an hour. We should be able to get through the expenditure review more quickly than that. But I think maybe if we go first to page 18, and probably should have gone here just to give everybody the overview in the beginning anyway, but there are actually two options, which I'll let Rick introduce. But right now we want to talk about the expenditure review, and the concept that we're working with is that the expenditure reviews would be performed by OPSC as the agency with the basic knowledge of the program. And I'm hoping that we can talk about, after we kind of get a basic introduction, we can talk about the triggers and what triggers the review, because I think that's an important discussion, and also how would expenditure reviews in this process, where we've moved some other pieces to other areas, how would expenditure reviews differ from what they are now at OPSC. And so, Rick, do you want to just look at the two options with us?
So if we go back, so now we're looking at option 1, option 2, where we're looking at the 3 phases: the incremental compliance check, the SAP expenditure review, and the field audit. We just looked at the incremental compliance check. Ironically, when you look at the middle section, the SAP expenditure review, those are not really being impacted, other than the fact that if you go the 18-month route, then you're looking at an extra 4 months before you start looking at things. So there's really no change within that process there. I think one of the things that we're kind of grappling with, though, is we have a current standard right now. We have a project that will fall onto our audit workload, our review workload list, once a number of things happen, whichever occurs first. 100% report, or 3 years, 4 years to complete the project, whether it's elementary or high school. The issue we're seeing right now is there are a number of projects that will sit out there and spin at 98, 99%, when in fact they're probably substantially completed, but they'll string it out to the 3-year or 4-year timeline. And so if the goal for us is to be able to shorten when we can get to the reviews and complete the reviews, I think we need to kind of take a look at that trigger and maybe come up with another option. I'll pass this over to Steve Inman. I think one of the things that we may want to take a look at is notice of completion.
If you look at page 17, I think Rick pretty much covered what's on that page. We wanted to think about potential triggers for the SAP closeout audit, and I think the expectation was in the context of what we had talked about earlier, the incremental reviews, that what is covered in the incremental reviews will eventually or ultimately shorten what we need to look at in the closeout reviews. So under the current standards, SAP projects are added to the fiscal workload list when one of the following occurs. Either 3 years elapses from the fund release for elementary schools, or 4 years for middle and high schools. Okay. Or if the district or COE submits a 100% expenditure report, whichever occurs first. If we receive that 100% expenditure report prior to the 3 or 4 year timeline, those projects automatically drop on into our system, and the 2-year clock begins for engagement for full audit. Okay. Again, I mentioned that down there. The only other option we investigated here was the notice of completion, and some of the stakeholders might have comments on it out here. The way SAP Regulation 1859.104 addresses the engagement, if this occurs prior to, if the notice of completion could be one indicator, if that occurs before the 3 or 4 year timeline, and all outstanding invoices, claims, change orders have been satisfied, and the facility is in use. Okay. If you look in the table, some of the bulleted items, there are other technical aspects that some of you out here know their significance that apply to that. Again, one of the issues involved is there could be several notices of completion for multiple contractors. Okay. I'm sure that happens quite frequently, so the timing on those might, suggest whether a project is complete or not complete. Again, and some of the major work may not be completed. So, if we wanted to discuss that.
Comments?
Well, just a couple things that we've talked about in the past, not only multiple NOCs, but sometimes even partial NOCs that might happen. You might have NOCs for particular buildings. If you're building a high school, multiple years, multiple everything. And as been stated before, I think the most common thing that we see, and the reason why a lot of districts tend to drag out at 98% all the time is because we haven't finished purchasing furniture and equipment, so to speak. The work is substantially done. We're in the building, we're using it, but the project, especially on a high school, it takes a long time to complete that. So that just might be some more bullets to consider, because I know we've done some partial NOCs from time to time, just for a variety of kind of oddball reasons, but
Generally, when you see them at 98 or 99 and they sit, a district likes to have a year in the facility, particularly if they have any F&E money left, to make sure that they've gone the whole cycle of everything they do in the building and haven't missed something. Those that set 2 or 3 years, yeah, I'm with you, but 1 year is really quite reasonable to be in the building for a year, using it to know that you've done everything and haven't missed anything major, because different things happen in the buildings at different times of the year. So just FYI, that's sometimes why they sit at 98.
I think what we wanted to kind of discuss is from a stakeholder standpoint, what might be provide a better option than what we're doing right now, what we discussed earlier. Is there something out there that would be a better trigger to, again, expedite this whole review process, especially toward the completion, when the project approaches completion?
And I wish I could offer something other than this, and maybe I could if I thought about it for a while, but I'm concerned about a notice of completion because, especially if you're anticipating that a notice of completion is a trigger that says we're done spending money on the project.
Yeah.
We're not. And so that I see this becoming problematic in that we're going to still continue to give you 98%ers even though we've filed an NOC. So I don't want us to get back into the same problem that we have now where we're constantly submitting DLOPs for several years that hang out there for a while. So it's logical, but I think there's just some inherent problems with it that may not end up getting us what we're really trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes the project has more than one major contract. You may have certain work that's not a part of the main bid. You may hold out your parking lots and all your asphalt work to be done after you're finished with your contract, or, there are things that happen that projects are nothing if they're not inconsistent. They're really, every one of them, a different animal. So NOC might not be the trigger, but maybe a time, I don't know. Is that what you were looking for, something that tells you when the project's really done?
Yes. Both.
Is it when we're done spending money?
Go ahead, Jeff.
I guess that's what I was trying to get clarity on, or what was the issue with the current standard that we're looking for a new trigger or a new standard?
Well, I think the issue that I've heard expressed and that's been expressed by the members of the board and the chair is a concern that it takes too long to get to a final expenditure review under this program, and the length of time that it drags out creates issues potentially for school districts and creates a situation where, as you said before about your discussion about changing personnel in the district, access to files, people can't provide the information that's needed, something comes down from a review that means a district has to pay money back, and then it creates a problem that surfaces at the state allocation board. So,
and you triggered a thought in my mind, and from what I remember, wasn't part of when we were talking about the incremental reviews and when we were meeting before was to look at expenditures during those incremental reviews versus doing a one-time final closeout expenditure review. And I guess that's the piece that maybe we are not incorporating into the incremental review yet, and that would be something to consider, because I guess maybe I missed where we were at with that, but and that's why I think the timing is a problem, is by nature of these projects, they are going to be 2, 3, 4 years out before you're going to do an expenditure review if you're waiting for it to be final. And if that was incorporated into the incremental piece, then you could look at expenditures mid-project and determine if there are current pressing issues that need to be addressed, or another funding source needs to reimburse the program because there was something that you didn't feel was appropriate. That's my thought.
Mm-hmm. So I think the issue is, a project can take anywhere between 4 to 5 years to complete. And if you're talking about an incremental review where we would take a look at expenditures on the front end within 1 year, 18 months, whatever it is, you're going to have a limited sample of what you're going to be looking at. I mean, we could look at that, but realize the other, 80% or 90% that's going to go on after the fact, we're going to have to take a look at. So, that's something to consider. I think you're going to have a very small amount of expenditures to look at within that 12 to 18 months.
I think it's almost going to be an issue that needs to be accepted if we're going to look at the approach from we need to wait till the end just because that's just how many years it takes. I mean, I don't know that there's a resolution to that problem.
There may not be, but let's see. Let's keep looking.
I have an out-of-the-box idea, okay? See if we can wrap our heads around this. If, let's say we have a simple 50-50 project, the district's putting up a 50% match. In many cases, the districts will match it and then some. That's a fairly typical project. Probably an enormous number of the projects go down that road. If you looked at it from a sheer numbers perspective and said, let's assume the first half of the money spent is spent on the SAB items. If a district has spent 50% of the project, all of the expenditures tie out and are in fact legitimate, the size of the construction contract that they're bound to warrants that they're either going to have a messy truncation of a contract at that point, or they're going to finish out okay on the 65% rule. And actually, anything you accept at audit simply will go back and be declared as savings. Then really you could audit once they meet the 50% point on a clean project. It is a grant. So the part the district contributes, there can be a reasonable assumption they're going to finish out. In fact, you can have a closeout requirement that the IOR has to submit, yes, they built everything they said they would build when they were granted the money, and you're good. So the fact that you have to wait till the district puts all their half of the money in, I think we've gotten used to looking at it that way, and it's almost a holdover from the lease purchase program that we had before SB 50, because the state's responsibility is to look at the grant portion. If we looked at it that way, you could really move up when you do that final audit. If you have a very clean project, you've looked at it at 65%, maybe you're in the second or third year, there are no issues in this project, obviously meets the grant requirements. I think you just need you could final audit it then if you had the time available.
How does that work with the cash management at the district level and the funds that they're expending out of? So on a typical project?
Right. Well, typically right now the district's spending up to 100% before they get the state funding.
Oh, okay. I mean, but,
right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but from OPSC's perspective, they don't ask us on a detailed listing of expenditures whether we've spent Fund 35 money or Fund 21 or whatever money. It's just what have you spent the money on in the project, knowing that the timing of when you have those is really all over the board based on how the district does their funding. And I'm not sure it's pertinent, which is why it's not on the DLOP. It's not necessarily pertinent if the district has spent the proportional share of the grant, and that's auditable. You could start the audit at that point.
I think we've talked about this issue in the past that some DLOPs aren't even some of us don't even put some expenditures on a DLOP because we know it's not going to be considered an eligible expenditure, so therefore why even put it on there? But then we go back to wanting total project cost and good information on your PIW and all that. They're all interrelated, but and it's not out of the box because I was thinking the same thing that you were. Something as simple as when you fill out a DLOP, this column means it's a state item that should be checked for eligibility, and this item that I purchased or paid for, whatever, is something that's coming out of the district share. So as Letty said, the rate things are going, we could get to the state share pretty quickly, which could prompt, I don't know what that trigger would look like, but and then once you've gotten beyond that, then, then you're not worried about the 98% because typically anything past the 98% is going to be, unless you're financial hardship.
Yeah, I was going to say that would
yeah.
be the only exception.
Financial
the
hardship would be
financial
a
hardship.
completely
It
different
has to be
animal.
an
It always
animal
is,
by
yeah.
itself. Yeah.
So let me throw something out here. So isn't the basic concept behind a 50-50 is that for every dollar of expenditure, 50% of that is the states and 50% is district. So if you're starting to throw out this idea that you spend the state's apportionment first or their part first, you still need to account for the back end for the district. It's almost as if as you pay, that same ratio is being held true for all the expenditures as you move through the project.
Why is that true if I could declare it savings? So if I had a project and 35% of it wasn't required by my match and I declared it savings, that would be perfectly allowable. So how does that?
Well, you can declare savings, it has to be verified.
Oh, that's right, you guys have a stick.
At some point, you can't, you're making a lot of assumptions, and I think, thinking outside the box, in theory, it sounds good, but there's a lot of assumptions out there, and you don't know how it's really going to kind of play out toward the tail end of a project.
So,
But I think that's because we're not considering it a grant. If you granted me this to build this, and I build that, so it's the state's assumption that they have to control the money, even our half of the money beyond the grant, I think is where districts have always felt that was, hey, what part of it is a grant? Because it doesn't feel like a grant.
Yeah, and I've always looked at it as the state's going to give me an allocation of, of $100 for this project, and I just need to delineate how I spent that $100 on eligible expenditures. If I want to spend, and then I'll spend my 100 to match, but if I want to spend another 100 on something else that's not eligible, then that's the district's choice. So it's a little bit different way of looking at it. Instead of each item shared all the way down until you get to your magic amount, I look at it as I check off the items that I know are going to be eligible expenditures until I get to at least my 50%. And then beyond that, it's kind of my own stuff. So it's just a different way of looking at it.
I have another way of looking at that might simplify it. I know when we work with our clients, very typically the general contractors contract, the architect's contract, and the site money is more than uses up the OPSC share. And I know that because the way we do it, we have them transfer expenditures in to use up the OPSC share, and you can do that on almost every project with only 3 object codes of transfers. Site, architect, and contractor eat up all the OPSC share because they're huge. They're usually more than 80% of the project dollars. So I think concentrating on those 3 things for compliance with the project, there may in fact be many projects where by really looking at and verifying those 3 components, it meets all the criteria of the expenditure requirement. Anyway, it might be worth looking at because I know that those 3 items alone more than take the state share.
So could let me just if I can characterize this. So what you're talking about here is some kind of a partial
for projects
completion review
that don't appear to have any
normal
problem.
Projects without problems. Doesn't sound to me like it works with a financial hardship project. So that's one thing. So I'm not getting a warm and fuzzy from Rick on it, but it's okay.
One other thing.
about it.
So you're talking about 50-50. If you've got new construction, you need to be able to reconcile down the road any kind of site adjustment, any kind of hazardous waste, DTSC, a whole myriad of things. So how do you take care of that if you're making the assumption at the 65% level as far as the expenditures? You need that final report to be able to figure out if there's money that's going to the district or money coming back to the state, because you can adjust those particular line items.
So
and you won't know that at 65%.
And he brings up a really good point, and this does many times.
you've taken the
additional
extra money.
funds that go to the district because there's additional DTSC expenditures, site-related, and then so there's that issue, and there's the issue of the financial hardship districts where we really need to get to the end, right? essentially to make a final calculation of what the savings were. So, okay, good, out of the box. I have one, too, out of the box.
Okay.
And OPSC already had it, and I told them, don't put this on there because it's not legal right now, or it's not current right now. But that is, I didn't mean legal. I meant that it's not something we do. Tie the the final expenditure review to the certificate of occupancy. And as everyone knows, schools don't have a certificate of occupancy. There is discussion about that issue, and it's coming from DSA related to issues about certification of projects. That aside, it answers the question of multiple contracts. There may still be contracts that are not fully closed out after a certificate of occupancy, but at least you would be hard-pressed to say if you have a CO for the project, most of your buildings are probably done, and you've got kids in them, that kind of thing. So something to think about is another trigger point. Again, looking at it through the lens of how can we streamline this, how can we get things started earlier than some of the timelines we have now.
I think one of the, and I was thinking about that earlier too, and I think that's a very good thought to explore in the future, but I think getting back to the point of, auditing those expenditures that have already occurred at some point in time really relates to the third item of this meeting, and that is the external audits. Because we talked about this a little bit last time as we were all together. How could we maybe get into the final expenditures and have those off the plate with the annual audit. We're done with that. They don't get audited again. We go forward, and then all you're dealing with is the end game. I mean, I don't see why in the world we can't, at some point, clear those expenditures off like we do all other expenditures, because these projects do go on for a long time. We had a high school that was built in multiple phases. And so you can have the occupancy, but as you really think about it, why don't you correlate the final expenditures with the regular audit and just be done with those expenditures? If they're audited and they meet, all of the audit tests and provisions, and why not say, okay, we're good with that and go forward? Just then you're auditing at the end only the expenditures that you need to at the very end. I mean, it just makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think the biggest issue that I can see with that is that the final expenditure audits, and Rick, you can throw me a lifeline anytime I go out too far out to sea here, the final expenditure audits under the program often have cash implications for one way or the other, from the state to the state, from the district, and so there's a need to calculate those, take that back with a state allocation board action, and if we put that, what I was hearing you say is put that off and let that go into the external audit function, I think.
No, not necessarily. No, I mean, if there's a problem with an expenditure that's not acceptable under the program, you deal with it at that point. You don't wait until the end of it, to deal with it. If somebody has an infraction against any other education program, you deal with it at that point, and you assess the penalties or whatever you have to do at that point, and you move forward. I'm not suggesting that we would put all of that off until the 5th year and then you have interest accumulation. If you already know you have an issue and you have a problem, you deal with it at that time. And I don't know if you want to wrap this up. I know it takes regulation. There's a lot of steps to go through before you could finally get this, correlated with the annual audit and get that incorporated with the audit standards and provisions that auditors have to go through. But it just makes sense to me. Then those are just off. If you have an issue, you pay for it at that time. It goes to the board, whatever you have to do. I wasn't suggesting that we wait until the end to deal with those penalty assessments, no.
Okay, so are we talking about multiple incremental reviews? Is what I'm hearing?
Just saw his workload go
Yeah,
up.
I had the same
over
thought. They don't
Oh, no,
actually
I-
review the 5006 every time you submit it. They just make sure that it's in. It's a component of, okay, they're progressing, right? But it really gets reviewed when you check final.
At the tail end.
Yeah, and that's at the 4th and 5th year, which is, what
And-
brought us all here in the beginning was, how do we, make this a little bit easier on everybody, and you don't get so far out into the future where if you had a problem way back here, you should know about it and deal with it, because at that point, if you're a growing district, you're probably entering multiple projects doing the same problem, or doing the same thing wrong each and every time. You don't want to wait until the 4th and 5th year.
Yeah, I understand
to
that,
incur
but
that.
think of it as if you have a high school, and if you go the full 4 years, you're looking at 5006s for every single year.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have the staffing to be able to look at every single 5006 that comes through on any given year. One of the things that we have talked about, and we're still trying to kick around this trigger idea, and I don't know what we're going to come up with, but one of the other things that we're proposing, if you go back to our flow chart, in the blue area under the SAP expenditure review, the second orange box, we're also talking about cutting down the amount of time that something will sit on the workload, rather than 2 years, make it down to 1 year. So we're trying to find ways to condense things.
That really makes sense.
But if you're talking about multiple incremental reviews, that's burdensome on the district and on us.
So you're getting the expenditure reports, and tell me if I've got this wrong, but you're getting the expenditure reports periodically.
Every year.
And you're basically
Once a
saying
year.
we're not going to do anything about that until the end, or are you doing a preliminary review at that point, or
We don't touch it until we get to the tail end
then
of the
why
project.
are we having them?
It's a requirement in regulation,
Okay?
once a year.
We're
I
not
would dare
doing
say
anything.
it is important that districts get to that level of work incrementally while the work is current. You would not want a district to think, oh, I don't have to submit that for 4 years, and so they don't do anything about it. Those are the nightmare cases, I know, for us and for you, when you go into a district that didn't account properly
And
as
one-
they
Also
went.
problematic when you get to the 4th year and somebody has changed out staff, or they have, deleted those records that are more than 3 years old, accidentally, whatever, and they're not there for your final review anyway. I think this is kind of a big problem.
I think if I'm understanding right, to incorporate in the annual audit, what would happen is that an auditor would ask, did you file a 5006?
Right.
And if they did, then the auditor would include a sampling of expenditures on the 5006 during the course of the annual audit. And that gets you that that review, or that routine review of the expenditures. Now, we're not talking about, I wouldn't characterize it as an incremental review. It would just be a part of the annual audit.
So that you'd review the expenditures for whether they're allowable or not, based on a set of criteria.
Sure.
that-
They do it now for every other program.
They don't review, you would add that they review it for program compliance, that they are allowable. Because we
I've
had
done-
talked about them,
I'm sorry,
that
lady.
not being what it was, that the OPSC audit would do the compliance, and the district's audit would be for internal control, and that the expenditures were done correctly by
That was
process.
my understanding too, I think the way we kind of had it laid out, yeah. I guess the other question is, if you find something that's ineligible, then does it go to the Education Audit Appeals Panel? Does it go to the SAB? I mean, how do you handle that?
Well, those were questions.
Oh, well, if we're doing the annual audit, and that's part of the audit, and we find an expenditure that we believe is non-compliant, it results in a state compliance audit finding that gets reported to the state controller, the California Department of Education, and all the oversight agencies over that district. And from that point, we'll make some recommendations. Generally, what's going to happen is we're going to recommend that the district reimburse the program for the unallowed expenditures. So whoever is doing the oversight of that is probably asking the district what the corrective action was, and the district's going to provide supporting documentation that they refunded the money for that expenditure with some other district money, and then it's a resolved finding, and you move forward. So the program has the money back, and in the next year it would go towards something else. So there is a process when you do have unallowable cost type findings for that review and corrective action in the annual audit. The one thing I was wondering is if that's the route that we go, annually, yes, those expenditures will be reviewed. Will they be reviewed for the things that OPSC is looking for? That's where I would be looking for the clarity on, obviously that's maybe a little bit further down the road, but what is OPSC looking for when they want to look at expenditures versus what the auditors would be looking for? Because as part of the state audit guide, or the EAP audit guide, that is generally a compliance compliance-driven audit guide, and then we use our risk assessment standards to apply, our audit techniques to audit expenditures on a sample basis. And I believe the Fund 35 expenditures at one point in the past were even in the EAP audit guide for a while, so we were at one point even looking at that, those expenditures for that purpose. So is there more to it than that OPSC does in a final expenditure review, or would that suffice? And then the other part of that is what I was going to say, is the timing issue, because I saw the timing as being a really problematic. If you're going to ask for an external audit, you want that to occur annually versus at some point in the future where you're looking at 4 years combined, because exactly you get into non-compliance issues too many years later.
I think as you craft those particular provisions for the auditors, for the annual auditors, that you fold into those requirements those things that OPSC wants to see. I see that as a reduction in workload on your department, actually. In the long run, I do realize that it's going to take some time to implement. I think we talked about a 2 or 3 year process before that could be, fully vetted in the audit process and through regulation and so on and so forth. But I see that as actually a benefit to the department, where you would actually have, less of a workload. You could focus on maybe some of the other critical aspects of the program, but ensure that the standards that you're looking for are incorporated in the auditor's standards.
The other thing I was going to mention really quick is, in looking at the proposed process right now, it doesn't really lay out that way. The way it looks right now is you would still do your expenditure reviews, and then certain triggers might prompt a field audit. So I don't know how that would work, because the way, or would the field audit occur on a regular basis for everybody, or is it only going to occur if certain things are met? Because that would be problematic, because once it's in the EAP audit guide, generally it's something that we're going to automatically do every year for every district.
Can I, Shiloh did a great job of segueing us into part 3, okay? So, we had it there, the group, but can we go ahead and start to focus a little bit on the external audit function? We already were heading, and what I was just hearing as the end of this discussion was, is there a way, and so, help me out here, but what I was hearing was that there was some interest in looking at how could a portion of expenditure reviews occur within the context of the annual audit.
Correct.
Without getting into a lot of detail about it, that's what I heard. So it seems like that's something that you want us to look at and come back with, right? And just said that's really the start of the discussion. So Shiloh mentioned, I think, the issue of the triggers. To me, this is a really important one, and I put on my on the agenda piece here. Does this happen to all school districts that have school facility program projects? Does it happen to a random annual selection? Does it happen to a risk assessment group?
If you put it in the audit guide, then it's going to happen to every school district that has submitted a 5006 during that annual audit period, that fiscal year. So that's how it would start.
Okay. So that's considering that if the expenditure review goes into that piece.
Right.
So step back from that one again for a sec, and we can talk about the scope issue. What if the annual audit components were primarily focused on districts that had school facility program projects or county offices with school facility program projects, and the fiscal controls, procurement methods, what else am I looking for? Other elements that may not be checked as part of just a standard expenditure review for allowable, disallowable.
Well, also your internal control features, which kind of goes to some of your provisions that really are not addressed in any of the reviews right now, to the standards that auditors would address them in a normal audit situation for a district. So that would be one.
And those are automatically looked at every year.
Right.
An auditor goes out and they assess internal controls. They assess internal controls over the district, as a whole. They're not looking specifically, let's say, at a certain program. And so they're going to get a feeling and an understanding of how well those controls are working. And if it's over purchases, for example, it's going to apply regardless of what program it is. Now, there may be some additional reviews for, facilities. There may be some certain key areas you may have to look at, but the auditor will design their test to look at internal controls. And then from there, if you have a 5006, the auditor is going to take that 5006, and they're going to take certain expenditures, and that can be guided to a certain extent by the audit guide. And they're going to audit those expenditures against not only the internal controls that should be in place, but also for compliance purposes if that's put in the audit guide.
I would suggest too that like some of the other programs have certain threshold levels, that there are more audit. What is it? What is the word I'm looking for? The audit plan would be more extensive in those particular programs. And, they wouldn't necessarily be looking, for example, at contracts. So maybe that could be part of the standards that are built in, that very specific things would be looked at, for projects over X, especially if it relates to the school facilities program. Then they would have their own little subset of standard items that auditors would look at for projects that were over a certain threshold amount of money that would meet the interests of the OPSC group right now. I mean, I'm just kind of trying to think, how could we, part of our mission is to reduce the workload, streamline the process, and ensure that at the end game, districts don't owe a whole bunch of money back, because they've spent the money inappropriately, or they've filled out one of these forms too early or something like that. We don't want districts to get 4 and 5 years out there and not have the records and not have the original staff that filled them out that understand what they did in the first place. So I thought part of what we were trying to, be brought together to solve would be, reduction of workload, and also getting back to this whole grant concept, where you don't have to audit every single expenditure that comes through. Make it part of the normal process that, school districts go through anyway. Just kind of add that in. That's way out of the box. It's pretty quiet up here.
Arlene, did you have a comment?
I had a question on your 5006, your expenditure. Is that done at the end of each fiscal year? Is it fiscal
It's
year?
due 1 year after the fund release, the first one is, and then every year after until the completion of the project.
Every
Your
12 months?
anniversary
On your
date.
anniversary?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had somebody that went through the 4 years, there would be 4 5006s.
Could it be something that was designed to align with the fiscal year, so that way, if it does get incorporated into the annual audit, we would have something that more appropriately aligned with the fiscal year? I mean, you might have the initial year where maybe you have some extra months or something like that, but the timing of that, is that something that could change?
That could be, that's an option. You'd have to have a regulation change, though, on that.
From a workload perspective, I think it might be difficult to add preparation of the 5006 at year end when we're already doing a ton of stuff at year end. So one of the nice things about the 5006 is it's rarely due at year end. Your odds of being on a June or July board are less than being on other boards, and so the anniversary date then doesn't hit year end. It's fine, like our clients would be fine, they press a button and print the report, but a lot of districts go through that and manually create that 5006. It's a ton of work if you do it that way.
Yeah, we'll probably just need to consider how to incorporate the appropriate audit procedure if you're talking about a different timeline, because it's not going to tie and work into the fiscal year we're auditing, and so I don't know how that would work into the procedures, but that would just have to be addressed. Are we going to be working off the 5006, or are we just going to be working off the general ledger that we know flow into the 5006?
Right, you could use whatever funds are funding the project.
And so to step back on what Shadow was talking about earlier on resolving an expenditure audit finding, so right now when we get those, the Department of Education looks at those and we require, and I guess depending on what the district's response is, but if they're agreeing with it, we actually want to see a copy of the journal entry that takes it out of whichever special fund they charged it to and shouldn't have. But one thing about expenditure reviews, I think earlier OPSC was going to be updating your program review handbook that clearly outlines what expenditures are appropriate and not appropriate. I think that's very key if external auditors are going to be doing expenditure reviews to know what is or isn't acceptable.
Okay, so we weren't going to go that far because the regulation and the statutes kind of lay out what's eligible and what's not eligible.
Okay.
We did put out, and I don't want to steal Bill's thunder here, but we did put out a couple of lists that are just, for example, keep in mind, so this is for allowable and disallowable SFP expenditures. Keep in mind, every project has its own little nuance. It might have to be on a case-by-case. It could be phase-driven. There could be a whole bunch of things to consider.
Page 20.
Yeah, page 20 and then page 22.
So I think we heard your concern last time about this and in some of the previous discussions about wanting to have clarity. So if part of the annual audit component was to use an expenditure review element, obviously we're going to have a pretty high level of clarity about what's allowable and not allowable, right?
So we would advocate, so we had the clarity is to put this in regulation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, let's be direct about this and people know where they stand and we can lay it out. Now, I don't know how much in the way of how big the regulations are going to get, but you're talking about quite a bit of information to put in there.
Would it be helpful, instead of trying to list comprehensively in regulation every allowable expenditure, and then this list also has disallowable expenditures as examples, to list, basically list examples of allowable and then say other allowable expenditures per statute. And because every project is unique and needs to be looked at based on what that project is, and is there a nexus between the SFP grant and the expenditure?
I think it could be referenced. I don't think that it has to. I think that the regulation could be more global so that they'd have the ability to amend it, plus or minus. If they needed some items to be amended, you want to keep that as global as possible and then, have it referenced, like many other programs that have allowable, disallowable expenditures that, that are referenced separately from the regulation, but they're kind of called out in there. Then I don't think that you would have to have 1,400 pages of regulation to account for this stuff. Just a thought.
Yeah, the one thing I do caution when we do get into talking about making regulation, is the thing that as auditors we're always dealing with is the more vague it is, the more difficult it is to audit. We see this with a lot of different programs, and so the more resource there is for us to utilize when we are doing the audit, the better, and the more effective audit we'll be able to conduct is based on how much information we have to go off of to determine eligibility. So, I understand vagueness in regulation is generally intended and serves a purpose, as long as there's guidance provided by OPSC for us to utilize when we are making those determinations that are, like a separately referenced type document, so that we can really conduct the thorough audit that you would be looking for. When it gets too vague, then, if it's not in regulation, then it's subject to interpretation.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
So can we talk just for a minute about how, if we wanted to develop this external audit component for school facilities program, what's the timeline, what's the implementation process? to do that? What's required?
Okay. So basically what's required is that OPSC would come forward to Controller's Office and present their proposal as to how they'd like us to, this to be incorporated into the K-12 audit guide. We have an audit guide committee that meets, and it's composed of a number of different players, Department of Education, Department of Finance, Cal Society of CPAs, and then various interested individual or parties with respect to education. So, anybody could come to the table, obviously, at the audit guide committee meetings, and we would discuss the proposal. And once the committee has agreed to accept the proposal, we go about writing audit procedures. And those audit procedures are submitted to the Education Audit Appeal Panel, and then the Audit Appeal Panel basically rewrites our procedures more in legalese, and they submit it to the EAP panel to approve, and they also submit it to the Office of Administrative Law for approval and incorporation into the California Code of Regulations. It's at least a 2-year process to get them the audit procedures incorporated. And when you're going through this process, EAP has a number of attorneys, and they make sure that what has been written is actually supported by statute and regulation.
So this fall, starting in September or October, we'll start meeting for the 13-14 audit guide. And then usually the proposal is submitted to the Education Audit Appeals Panel in January. Which gives them time to adopt the 13-14 audit procedures into regulations prior to the start of the fiscal year. So they have to have it adopted by July 1st. So that's when we start early.
And one thing is this would be for audits going forward, so 13-14 forward. So if there are projects that you want it reviewed that are currently in process, they wouldn't look back. They would go forward with expenditures. So it's almost like it's for projects starting 13-14 forward. I think you might have to have another process for
Things that are already in progress.
Right, exactly. I just kind of thought about that.
So if I think about it in the context of the State Allocation Board, it strikes me that we realistically probably would not be able to get involved if the board decided to do this. It would probably occur at some point later in the fall, is my guess, of this year, and so it would probably be something that would happen starting next year, because presumably we'd have to go through our own process of regulation related to whatever comes out of this. I'm just thinking out loud, but it sounds like the timing isn't really right for this year, and there'd be plenty of work that we'd need to do both with our stakeholders and with OPSC and the board developing a proposal and taking it forward and then getting there. So, but thank you for that. That's good, the timeline.
Bill, there are interim things that could be done if we begin to move to a new process. OPSC could publish a guideline or criteria for districts to contract with an independent auditor to conduct those audit things and list maybe, review of annual expenditures, review of internal controls, verification of fraud, whatever you call it, guidelines, or that they're in compliance with public contract code or whatever. And then districts could contract with their current auditor or another independent auditor to accomplish that in a transitional period while that's all getting done, in much the way we do performance audit as a separate contract.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some tweeners for timelines.
Yes. So I think that I think we can, everybody okay with where we ended up? I guess what I heard that's the biggest movement in terms of where we came into the meeting, in terms of the materials, is I heard the discussion go towards incorporating elements, incorporating 5006 expenditure reviews into the education audit as opposed to just, I think when I walked in the room I was thinking that there was a different defined scope that maybe started out in the external field audit. But what I think I heard was that the group said, well, partly in response to some of the concerns about how expenditure audits and the timing of expenditure audits by expenditure reviews by LPSC, that the education audit could include on an annual basis, and let me make sure I understood this, for all school districts that participate in the SFP, that they would review or submit a 5006, let's say, that they would review that as part of the education audit on an annual basis. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. And that's a big change from what we do now. So want to digest this. So anyway, it seems like we should do some follow-up work with OPSC because it wasn't what they were expecting, I think, coming into the meeting today either. But so it sounds like we need to do some work internally to think about, there's probably some issues that I can see there. A couple of them that come to mind are, let's say OPSC, when they do a final expenditure review for right now, Rick, you don't do a final expenditure review or a final audit for all districts. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you're now doing a sampling anyway. So in this scenario that we were just talking about, it seems like we have some increased level of accountability, which I think is good. But I think there may still be a subset of projects or apportionments or districts or county offices or facilities, elements that OPSC is still going to want to conduct a final expenditure review on that would tie back to potential adjustments in the cash that would go to the state allocation board, right? Rick, help me out here.
That's correct,
okay?
yeah. We would have to take something to the board if we have to do any kind of adjustment up or down, yeah.
Well, but I did hear the conversation from the audit side of the house, I'm sorry, which said that they have a mechanism. There is a mechanism for adjustments. Is that correct?
That's correct. The other thing is that keep in mind, even if there's an annual audit of expenditures, that doesn't preclude OPSC from going in and taking a look at a specific district.
That was really the point of my saying what I was saying.
And so basically what a lot of times we use the annual audits, especially if you see issues, is to use them to build upon and go out and focus specifically on a district that may be problematic. So rather than spreading your resources, limited resources and trying to cover a lot of districts, you can use the annual audit to focus your resources on, districts that may be problematic.
Excellent. Good.
So are you saying then that, let me just say, I think it would be appropriate for the extent of funds that are not issued as full and final, they have to go back and be looked at, right? We have a couple of program components. So the final would be looking at a final 5006 or some type of document that says here's what ultimately we spent on the project that verifies we made our match. And depending on the project and its risk factors, that may or may not be an in-depth review.
That's correct, but just keep in mind if you have a project that has line items that can be adjusted, we still have to go through that process of eventually taking something to the board also.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you say line items that can be adjusted, you're talking about as a result of your review and your determination that they're not allowable?
Not necessarily not allowable. So for instance, let's say that you have a 50-50 project, you have site acquisition, $5 million for the state, $5 million for the district, and let's say you only spend $8 million. there has to be an adjustment for that difference between the 10 million and the 8 million. So we'd have to take something to the board.
So it would be a desk review type of audit. You wouldn't actually be looking at, you wouldn't necessarily be having to require supporting documentation. The information is on the 5006 for you to do those evaluations and adjustments?
We could ask for documentation
Right.
associated with that. Yeah.
You could, but not necessarily that that it has to be. I'm just curious.
yeah.
The determination can be made looking at the 5006. You'll identify the problems you're looking for if they exist, right? From looking, I realize that, yeah, you might definitely want to go to the backup just to confirm. And when you do your audits, are they 100% or do you normally sample as well?
We don't normally do 100%.
Okay,
I mean,
okay.
to be realistic, there's just so many.
Well, and that's what I was hoping you would
expenditures.
say, because I was going to go down the line of I would imagine, I would foresee the audit procedure would be a sampling basis and making sure that you're aware of that. One other comment I'll just make, and if we do really go down the road of making this part of the audit guide, and there's obviously a cost associated with that for the district, and one way or another, I don't know if that, generally when there's an audit requirement for program funds, the program allows those costs to be charged to the program, and I don't know if that's a consideration here. I'm just throwing that out there, but there's definitely a cost component to that. So
It's definitely above my pay grade. So.
We had talked about that a year and a half ago, too. I remember that did come up, what would we do with the associated costs? But I think with anything else, if the district is coming to the state for funding, then they would expect to have some additional costs in the audit. I think that would just be a natural occurrence. But I think the question on the table really is that going to be an allowable expense? And if so, there's later conversation how that would be divvied out.
And I think that's really important to note, especially for financial hardship projects.
And then when we figure all this out, we need to have the whole discussion again as to how it relates to financial hardship. Because we keep saying, well, let's talk about the normal. But we have a lot of districts in financial hardship program, and they're phased. And we haven't talked about the phased elements of this. And we kind of need to loop back and say, okay, now let's actually talk about financial hardship.
Okay, is there any public comment? I just want to make sure that we don't leave the public out. Okay, hearing none. Let's go ahead and wrap it up. It's just about, it's 11:55. I think we came a long way. It was a good discussion. We have some follow-up work to do. Any other closing comments that people on the work group want to make? Thank you so much for your help and the discussion. OPSD staff, thank you, Rick and Steve, and all the other people back at the house. And we...
A next meeting date?
Yeah, let's set, my goal would be to set a meeting date or come up with some concept today. So is the first week in August? Well, I mean, I was just trying to put us on a kind of monthly... how many people are on vacation? Know that it wouldn't work at all.
Are you talking about August 7th?
Let's see. Well, I don't know. Anybody have a concept? Mm-hmm. How about Thursday the 2nd? August?
Of August?
I can't do Thursdays, sorry. It's just me.
And the 7th doesn't, the 15th is the rules and procedures, right? Yeah. August 7th is a Tuesday? So, tentative?
I'm good.
I'm good.
Shiloh, you're not good? Okay. But, well, if we can, August 7th is a Tuesday? Well, We're not going to be able to have, I mean, it doesn't make
We don't
sense for us
have
to go back
anything
to
to
the
get
audit
them.
subcommittee until we've wrapped up our work here.
Right.
And we can get back to the chair of the committee and subcommittee and make sure that's okay.
I think preliminarily that's what we had looked at, but yeah, we may have to change it.
Okay. So is the 14th available? That's a Tuesday also.
I can't.
No, so 7th maybe, we've got most everybody? Okay, so tentative is 10 o'clock on Tuesday the 7th, and then I'll do a follow-up, inshallah. That's too bad, because you were great.
I can make it on the, oh, that's a Thursday. What about Wednesday, the 1st of August?
Works for me.
Because Thursdays you can't come, right?
I'll be in DC on the 31st and the 1st.
Why can't you be here on the 1st? And I mean, it's just DC, right?
Just pop in. I think I'm on a plane on the 1st.
Okay, so why don't I go ahead and I'll follow up with an email to everybody.
The 1st or the 7th, how's that?
Okay, I'll send something around, and Lisa Jones and I will work on scheduling the next meeting. Thank you very much for the input. It was great, and see everybody again.
I know.